Welcome to the LRF Group Real Estate Insights. I'm your host, bringing you the latest market intelligence and deep dives into the forces shaping the real estate landscape across the nation and right here in South Florida. Today, we are unpacking a critical issue that touches every corner of the market: America's chronic housing shortage. If you've been following the national conversation, you've likely heard that the United States is simply not building enough homes. For years, the prevailing narrative has pointed the finger squarely at one main culprit: overregulation. But a new, eye-opening report from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis reveals that the reality is far more complex. The housing deficit we are experiencing today is a decades-in-the-making crisis, and burdensome regulations are just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Let's start by looking at the sheer scale of the problem. The U.S. housing market has been chronically underbuilt for years. While estimates typically put the national housing shortage somewhere between 1.5 million and 4 million homes, a recent White House report suggested the deficit could be as high as 10 million single-family homes. Whichever number you look at, the conclusion is the same. We are facing a massive shortfall. To understand how we got here, the St. Louis Fed report takes us back in time. Permitting activity actually reached its peak in the early 1970s, hitting 10.6 building permits per 1,000 people. After some volatility in the 80s and 90s, permits began to climb again, only to crash spectacularly after the financial crisis of the late 2000s. Since the Great Recession, we've seen an uptick in permits and authorizations, but the report's authors, Manu Garcia and Carlos Garriga, describe this as an incomplete recovery. Today, single-family permits sit at just 2.9 per 1,000 people, well short of the historic average of 4.1. Even when looking at total permits, the numbers are stark. In 2024, total permits per capita stood at 4.3 per 1,000. That is still 35% below the average we saw from 1960 to 2000. As the report bluntly states, the U.S. is building less housing per person than at almost any point in the post-war era. This lack of building has led to incredibly tight inventory. To put this in perspective, the homeowner vacancy rate dropped to just 0.95% in 2024, the lowest on record, down from a peak of 2.9% in 2008. While it has ticked up slightly to 1.2% recently, it remains well below historic norms. So, if overregulation isn't the only cause, what else is driving this shortage? The Fed report highlights several critical non-regulatory barriers. First is a fascinating demographic shift: plummeting household size. In 1960, the average American household had roughly 3.4 people. By 2026, that number has fallen to just over 2.5 people. And research suggests it could fall even further. The National Association of Realtors recently found that 53% of Gen Z buyers, the oldest of whom are now approaching 30, bought a home on their own. The Fed report cautions that as average household sizes shrink and the desire for independent living grows, a static housing stock effectively becomes a shrinking one. We simply need more units to house the same number of people. The second major barrier is what the report calls the leaky pipe of supply. Getting a project approved, entitled, and permitted is a massive hurdle, but it's only part of the battle. The data shows a persistent lag where the number of permits issued consistently exceeds the number of actual completions. This leaky pipe became glaringly obvious in the years following the COVID-19 pandemic. Between the second half of 2020 and early 2022, there was a spike in building permits. However, many of those permitted projects stalled for years or died completely. Why? Because of skyrocketing costs. Borrowing costs surged in 2022 and have remained elevated. Combine that with inflation, severe supply chain disruptions, and a chronic labor shortage in the skilled trades, and building simply became too expensive. For many developers, the math no longer worked. The rents or sales prices needed to support the higher construction costs just weren't viable in certain markets. Interestingly, the report notes a recent shift. In 2024, per capita home completions reached 4.77, while permits came in at 4.33. This marked the first time since 2010 that permits actually trailed completions on a per capita basis, as builders finally pushed through the backlog of delayed projects. Of course, we can't ignore the regulatory side entirely. Local regulations, zoning restrictions, and lengthy approval timelines remain significant hurdles. However, there is some positive momentum here. We are seeing a wave of state and municipal reforms aimed at streamlining construction. For instance, Idaho recently passed legislation restricting local limits on starter home subdivisions and empowering local governments to implement missing middle housing plans. Furthermore, major cities like Seattle, Austin, Honolulu, and Los Angeles are now adopting artificial intelligence to streamline their permitting and approval processes, cutting review periods down by days or even weeks. What does all this mean for you, whether you're a buyer, seller, or investor? It means that the fundamental supply constraints in the housing market are deeply entrenched and won't be resolved overnight. This ongoing shortage will continue to support property values, particularly in high-demand areas like South Florida and New York, where the LRF Group operates. Navigating a market defined by tight inventory and complex economic crosscurrents requires experienced guidance. Your next chapter starts with one conversation. If you have questions about how this national housing shortage impacts your local market, your property's value, or your investment strategy, don't wait. A private consultation can be arranged to discuss your specific needs. The LRF Group specializes in luxury residential and commercial real estate, estate sales, and distressed properties. Reach out today and let us put over 25 years of proven expertise to work for you. The LRF Group is proudly affiliated with Berkshire Hathaway Home Services EWM Realty. Luxury is what we move. Remember, at the LRF Group, our services for your world. Thank you for listening.